One wet morning, after the strongest storm in years, the small coastal village in KwaZulu lay damaged, its huts soaked, its boats overturned. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and mud, and the sea, now calm, still roared softly in the distance, as though recovering from its fury. The villagers stirred slowly, emerging from their homes to inspect the damage. Amongst them was Lutando, a 15-year-old boy with bright eyes and a wild spirit. He had lived his whole life by the ocean, and though the sea could be dangerous, it was where he felt most at home. This storm, however, had been different. It had shaken the very bones of the village, and the elders spoke in hushed tones, wondering if it was an omen from the spirits. Lutando's mother called out to him as he prepared to head to the beach, but he waved her off with a grin. "Just checking on the boat, Mama," he said, though his mind was on something else. There had been something odd about this storm, something that tugged at his curiosity. As he walked down the narrow path toward the shore, his feet sinking into the wet sand, he noticed others gathering there as well. A crowd had formed near the water's edge, murmuring in low voices. Lutando pushed his way through, his heart racing as he wondered what could have caught their attention. Then he saw her. Lying half submerged in the sand was a creature he had only heard of in whispered legends, a mermaid. Her long, tangled hair reflected in the weak sunlight. Her skin, smooth from the waist up, was cracked and dry from exposure to the harsh sun rays. But it was her tail that drew the most attention. Once a shimmering silver, it was now marred by a deep gash, blood seeping into the sand beneath her. Lutando's breath caught in his throat. The mermaid was gasping, her chest rising and falling rapidly as if each breath was a struggle. Her eyes fluttered, barely open, and her fingers twitched as if she were trying to move. But the wound and the dryness of her skin seemed to keep her frozen in place. "Is she real?" someone in the crowd whispered. "Don't touch her," another said. "She could be cursed." But no one moved to help. Lutando, however, felt something stir inside him, a sense of urgency, of duty. This was no cursed being. She was suffering, and the crowd did nothing but stare, mesmerized by her beauty and mystery. Without thinking, Lutando turned and ran back up the beach. He grabbed a bucket from an overturned boat, filled it with seawater, and raced back to the mermaid's side. The crowd parted as he approached, some of them muttering disapproval. He didn't care. Kneeling beside her, he gently poured the cool water over her skin. Instantly, the change was noticeable. Her breathing slowed, and her eyes flickered fully open, focusing on him for the first time. For a moment, it felt as if time had stopped. Her eyes, a deep, oceanic blue, locked onto his. There was a silent understanding between them, a bond that formed in that brief exchange. But her body was still shaking, her tail trembling as though she were trying to swim away. Lutando knew what he had to do. He reached for her tail, his fingers brushing against the scales. They were cool to the touch, but beneath them, he could feel her pain, her desperation to return to the water. With all the strength he could muster, Lutando pulled. She was heavier than he had expected, but he didn't stop. Inch by inch, he dragged her toward the sea, ignoring the cries of protest from the villagers behind him. "You fool!" someone shouted. "Leave her. She belongs to the sea." But Lutando didn't stop. With a final push, he got her into the water. For a moment, she vanished beneath the waves, and Lutando feared the worst. Then, suddenly, she surfaced again. She looked at him one last time, as if to say thank you, and then she was gone, disappearing into the depths. Panting, Lutando turned back to face the crowd. Instead of gratitude, he was met with anger. "Why did you do that?" one man yelled. "We could have learned from her." Others murmured in agreement, but it was the voice of the village's oldest and most feared figure that silenced them all. The medicine man, an 80-year-old elder with a wrinkled face and piercing eyes, had just arrived. He leaned heavily on his walking stick, his voice cold with anger. "You are a fool, boy," he hissed, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "That creature was a gift from the gods, and you've let her go. I could have used her parts to make powerful medicines, magic that would have protected this village for generations. Now you've thrown that chance away." Lutando's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't considered any of that. He had only wanted to help. But the medicine man's words weighed heavily on him, and the crowd began to murmur again, their anger turning into something darker, fear. Over the next few months, life in the village returned to normal, but Lutando found himself isolated. People whispered behind his back, calling him reckless, a fool. Even his closest friends seemed distant, their eyes filled with doubt and suspicion. But Lutando couldn't shake the memory of the mermaid. At night, he dreamed of her, of the way her eyes had looked into his, the unspoken bond they had shared. He would wake with a strange longing, a pull toward the sea that he couldn't explain. Then, one day, it happened. Lutando had been out fishing in his small, homemade boat, as he often did. The sky was clear, the water calm, and he had almost forgotten the strange events of that stormy morning. But as the sun began to set, a shadow passed beneath his boat. At first, he thought it was just a large fish, but then the boat rocked, tipping dangerously to one side. Before he could react, the boat capsized, and Lutando was thrown into the water. Lutando hit the cold water with a hard splash, and the shock knocked the wind from his lungs. For a moment, he swung in the sea, disoriented, the world spinning around him. His boat was gone, overturned and sinking, the gentle waves now deceptively calm. Salt water stung his eyes as he struggled to stay afloat, the weight of his clothes dragging him down. He kicked desperately, trying to get a glimpse of what had caused the capsize. The shadow moved beneath him again, swift and silent. Panic set in. Lutando had heard tales of sea creatures, of monsters that lurked in the deep. Maybe the villagers had been right all along. Maybe something out there had come for him. His head dipped below the surface, water filling his mouth as he gasped for air. It was then that he felt something wrap around his ankle. His heart pounded in his chest as he instinctively tried to kick free, but the grip tightened. Just as he thought he was being dragged under for good, a familiar figure emerged from the dark depths. The mermaid. Her grip on his ankle was firm, but there was no malice in her eyes, only urgency. Lutando's fear began to subside, replaced by a strange sense of calm as he locked eyes with her once more. The water around them seemed to still, as if the sea itself acknowledged her presence. She pulled him down, deeper into the water, and though every instinct screamed for him to swim to the surface, he followed. They descended into the ocean, the light from above growing dimmer as the water darkened around them. Lutando's chest burned, his lungs screaming for air, but the mermaid's presence made him trust her, even in the face of certain death. Deeper and deeper they went, until the world above became a distant memory. Just when Lutando thought he could hold his breath no longer, the mermaid led him through a narrow crevice in the seafloor. They emerged into a hidden chamber, bathed in soft, glowing light from strange, luminescent corals that lined the walls. The chamber itself was dry, a pocket of air deep within the ocean, and Lutando collapsed onto the sandy floor, gasping for breath. To his utmost surprise, Lutando's clothes were now dry. Not even a drop of water remains on them. The mermaid watched him, her eyes filled with concern. Her once wounded tail was now fully healed, shimmering in the faint light. She moved with grace, her long hair floating around her like a living thing, and for the first time, Lutando realized just how powerful and otherworldly she truly was. "Why?" he finally managed to ask between breaths. His voice echoed in the chamber, sounding small and insignificant in the vastness of the ocean. The mermaid didn't speak, not in the way humans did. Instead, she moved closer, her fingers grazing the ground, tracing symbols in the sand. The symbols glowed faintly, and suddenly, Lutando could feel her thoughts, images and emotions flooding his mind in a way he had never experienced before. She was grateful for what he had done that day on the beach, for saving her life. But there was more. She had brought him here because he was in danger. The same shadow that had nearly taken his life today had been hunting him since that fateful morning. A dark force, older than the ocean itself, had been awoken the moment Lutando saved her, and now it was coming for him and for the village. Lutando stared at her, his heart racing again. but this time from a different kind of fear. What can I do?" he asked, his voice trembling. The mermaid's thoughts pressed into his mind again. She was going to teach him. The ocean held secrets, ancient powers that only a few knew how to control. Lutando was different. He had a connection to the sea that no one else in his village had, a gift that allowed him to sense and understand the waters in ways others couldn't. But if he wanted to protect himself, if he wanted to protect his people, he would need to learn how to harness that power. Time passed in the chamber. Hours, maybe days, Lutando couldn't tell. The mermaid showed him how to communicate with the sea, to feel its currents and hear its whispers. She taught him the stories of the ocean gods, of the creatures that lurked in the deepest trenches, and of the balance that kept the sea and land in harmony. He learned how to manipulate the water, how to summon the strength of the tides, and how to read the signs of danger in the wind and waves. Lutando's mind spun with everything he had learned. He couldn't believe what the mermaid told him about Medicine Man, respected and feared in the village. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Finally, the day came when the mermaid told him it was time to return to the surface. She couldn't leave her world, but Lutando had to deal with what she warned him about on his own. She gave him one last gift, an ancient shell, filled with the power of the ocean itself. If he ever found himself in desperate need, the shell would summon her to his aid. Lutando emerged from the water days later, his skin wrinkled and his body aching, but his mind sharper and more focused than it had ever been. The villagers had long stopped searching for him, convinced he had been lost to the sea. When he appeared at the shore, they were shocked, whispering amongst themselves about his survival. But Lutando was not the same boy who had disappeared. He had changed. His time with the mermaid had given him a quiet strength, a knowledge that set him apart from the others. At first, he kept what he had learned to himself, unsure of how to explain the impossible. But as time passed, the wisdom he had gained began to show in small ways. His fishing improved, his crops grew faster, and his advice to the village elders became terrifyingly accurate. People began to look at him differently, not with suspicion, but with amazement. Even the medicine man noticed. The old man's eyes followed Lutando wherever he went, and though he never spoke of it, there was a drop of recognition in his gaze, as if he knew that Lutando had learned something forbidden, something dangerous, and what he was warned about. Months went by, and Lutando visited the sea often, always returning with more wisdom and strength. But then, one fateful day, the mermaid appeared to him again, her expression troubled. This time, the news she bore was far more shocking than anything before. Lutando felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had known something was wrong, but not like this. He asked the mermaid what they could do, but her response left him shaken. There was no easy answer. This thing is massive, and Lutando would have to make an impossible choice. For 7 days and nights, Lutando didn't leave his house. He barely ate, barely slept. The weight of the mermaid's warning pressed down on him, suffocating him with the responsibility he now carried. He had the power to protect the village, but at what cost? What had the mermaid meant when she spoke of an impossible choice? On the 8th day, he finally gathered his strength. He called for a gathering at the chief's kraal, knowing he could no longer keep the truth to himself. The villagers gathered, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern as they waited for him to speak. Lutando stood before them, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "I've learned things about this village, about the sea, and about the old magic that ties us all together," he said, his voice steady but low. He told them about his encounter with the mermaid. The villagers murmured, exchanging worried glances. The chief looked at Lutando with a wrinkled brow. "What are you saying? What curse?" Lutando opened his mouth to continue, but before he could reveal the terrible truth the mermaid had told him, a shadow passed over the crowd. The villagers gasped, looking up to see a dark cloud rolling in from the sea, blocking out the sun. The medicine man stepped forward, his walking stick pounding against the ground. His eyes gleamed with something dark and dangerous. "What is this nonsense?" he hissed. "You don't know what you are talking about." But Lutando knew better. What the mermaid had told him was about to come true, but that part of the story would have to wait for another day. For now, tell us in the comments what do you think the warning was about. Share this story, like it, and subscribe for part 2.